Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a Path of Exile video on the best starter builds for the upcoming expansion, Trial of the Ancestors. I know a lot of folks might be jumping into Path of Exile for the first time, or we might have some returning players who want to give the game another try, so I coordinated with Path of Exile expert Arcthorin from maxroll.gg to come up with a list of 10 excellent builds to start the new league with. Now when we're talking about good league starters, what are we looking for? We're looking for builds that are not going to require a ton of lucky drops, or do a bunch of trading to get a bunch of gear. We're looking for builds that are going to scale well with the content, get you easily through the campaign and well into the endgame content, the mapping. But in the far endgame, these builds will be superseded by the best builds. But you can use these builds to farm up all the gear and trade currency that you need to transition into one of the best builds once you're ready to tackle the game's most challenging content. In the description, you'll be able to find links to build guides on all the builds that we're going to cover here, created by a variety of great Path of Exile content creators. Quick note, we're not ascribing ownership of any of these builds to any individual creator. There's been a lot of different versions of a lot of different builds that get modified, reemerge over the years, so we're just forwarding you to guides on these builds. And as always, you can find timestamps in the description to skip ahead to different builds. But first, a quick note on jargon. When we use the word budget, like low budget or high budget, we're talking about budget in the trade economy. When we describe something as low budget, that means that you can acquire it via trade with very little effort. Whereas a high budget build would require you to farm up a lot of trade currency to be able to afford the items. So if you don't want to trade at all, then you're looking for builds that are as low budget as possible. Also, we sometimes talk about clear speed. This refers to how quickly a build can clear or complete maps, which is Path of Exile's major endgame system. While this isn't something you're going to interact with at low level, it will become the major content that you farm to further empower yourself after the campaign. So let's get into our list, starting with number 1, Pox's Righteous Fire Inquisitor. Righteous Fire is a spell that makes you burn yourself for fire damage in order to deal big fire damage in an area around you. So you're hurting yourself, so to survive with this build, you want to stack a ton of life regeneration, maximum fire resistance, life, and energy shield. And Righteous Fire's damage actually scales with your life and energy shield, so stacking these will not only help keep you alive, but this is also going to kill enemies. On top of that, while using Righteous Fire, your spell damage is increased. Since it deals area damage, Righteous Fire is great at dealing with groups of enemies, but it is weak against single targets like bosses. To compensate, you want to work Fire Trap into the build, which lets you throw exploding traps that leave burning patches on the ground. This brings in the necessary damage to deal with bosses. To run this build, you start by taking the Templar class, which is a hybrid strength intelligence class, similar to a cleric in other games. Then you take the Inquisitor Ascendancy class, which focuses on enhancing elemental damage, perfect for buffing our fire damage. This has been a really popular build in PoE for years now. If you're looking for something with simple gameplay, with few buttons to press, this is a great option. You basically just activate Righteous Fire once at the start of the map, then you just run around with shield charge and everything burns to death. However, because of its weaker single target ability compared to some of the other builds on this list, killing bosses will take a while until you're well geared. The creator of this build, Pox, is highly regarded as an expert on Righteous Fire. It's his main build. It's been his main build for years. He's created multiple guides, and he's even created a wiki on the skill that addresses all of its nuances. Link in the description to his guide. On to build number 2, the Boneshatter Juggernaut. This build revolves around the Boneshatter skill. It's a melee attack that hits enemies so hard that some of that damage splashes back onto you. If you stun an enemy with this attack, a damaging pulse will shoot out of them, dealing area damage to monsters around you. The longer the duration of the stun on that enemy, the bigger the area of the damaging pulse. So this build is great at fighting packs of monsters. Now let's talk a bit about that damage that splashes back onto you. Every time you hit an enemy with Boneshatter, you gain a stack of trauma. While each stack of trauma that you have gives you a small damage buff, every stack also deals physical damage to you as well. This means that you want to focus on things that reduce the physical damage that you take, like armor. And you also want to stack life recovery to counteract the damage that you're inflicting upon yourself. And that's why the Juggernaut Ascendancy is, once again, a great choice. It gives you a ton of armor, and it also makes a portion of your armor apply to your elemental damage. So again, you take the Marauder class and then you move into Juggernaut. If you're looking for a melee build, this is the best melee league starter in the game. However, while it does great area damage, it struggles against bosses, and you also need a decent understanding of the game's crafting system in order to upgrade your weapons as you level up. On to build number 3, the Explosive Arrow Ballista Elementalist. With this build, you lay down ballista turrets. Those turrets shoot volleys of explosive-laden arrows at enemies, and then after a dramatic pause while their fuses burn down, those arrows explode. Oh, and the more arrows you got sticking out of an enemy, yeah, the bigger the damage and radius of the explosion. While you don't need to run Explosive Arrow with Ballista, the ballistas allow us to stack way more arrows onto an enemy, and therefore get bigger explosions. But that's not even the best part. The best part is the Ignite Proliferation mechanic, which means that even when an enemy dies, its corpse will stay on fire, and then other enemies walking over those burning corpses will catch fire as well. To run this build, you start by picking the Witch class, which is the basic spellcaster. Then you take the Elementalist Ascendancy, which turbocharges your elemental damage, the size of your explosions, and gives you a protective shield against incoming elemental damage. This build is very easy to gear, making it a painless league starter and an excellent choice if you don't want to get into trading. But also, if you do want to get into trading and you can invest heavily into your gear, this build's damage can ramp up to ridiculous numbers. The playstyle is really safe, because you just lay down your ballistas, and then you duck for cover. It isn't the tankiest build out there though, so if you want to play a hardcore safe version of this build, you can check out Zizzarin's Champion version instead. Also, not everyone loves a playstyle in which you're not actually the one dealing the damage. On to build number 4, the Lightning Arrow Deadeye. With Lightning Arrow, when you shoot an enemy with an arrow, a bolt of lightning then strikes that enemy and some other nearby enemies, giving it great area damage. Then to help with single target damage, the build also works in the Artillery Ballista skill, which summons ballistas that rain fire arrows down onto enemies. To run this build, you start by taking the Dexterous Ranger class, the Bow Expert, and then you take the Deadeye Ascendancy, which focuses on enhancing the power of projectile skills. You know, like arrows. This build can clear maps incredibly quickly. In fact, you'll have a hard time replicating this build's clear speed on any other build on an equivalent item budget. This build just specializes in clearing maps. It also scales really well with gear investment and into the endgame in general. Also, since it's using the Deadeye Ascendancy, it can easily transition into an endgame bow build later on without needing to create a new character, since sometimes your league starter is just used to farm the gear that you want for your actual main character, or you otherwise need to spend a ton of currency on respec. One warning though, this build is squishy, especially if you are not geared properly. If you're going hardcore, this probably isn't the build for you. Also, bosses can be a real pain to deal with, even with the artillery ballistas. The single target damage is really lackluster. It's all a sacrifice in the name of having such a high clear speed. On to build number 5, the Corrupting Fever Champion. Corrupting Fever is a spell that gives you a buff, and instead of costing mana, it costs life. This buff lets you inflict corrupting blood onto enemies that you hit. That's a debuff that inflicts physical damage over time. Kinda like bleed, but not bleed. Corrupting blood can stack up to 10 times on an enemy, but you need to be delivering that corrupting blood with another skill, and a great option here is Kinetic Blast, which fires projectiles from your wand that explode upon impact, damaging enemies in an area. So you can stack Corrupting Blood really efficiently because the splash damage from Kinetic Blast will inflict Corrupting Blood onto all enemies hit in the radius. This lets this build have great map clear potential. To run this build, you start off by picking the Duelist, which is a hybrid strength and dexterity class. It's great at both dealing and avoiding damage. Then you take the Champion Ascendancy, which is a great mixture of offense and defense, and makes this build incredibly tanky thanks to the damage reduction granted by Fortify and bonuses it grants to auras. Now, while this build has great clear speed and defenses that can scale really well with gear investment, it is weak against bosses, because you can only stack Corrupting Blood 10 times, so you'll have situations where you've maxed out your stacks and then you can't really do anything else to further damage the boss. On to build number 6, the Toxic Rain Ballista Pathfinder. If you want to rain chaos down on your enemies, this is the build for you. Toxic Rain is a skill that shoots arrows up into the air, which then are rained down as chaos damage pods that explode on enemies. These pods linger for a while, dealing damage over time, so you can stack them in order to deal massive boss damage. This build is a great all-rounder. To run it, you start with the Ranger class, and then move into the Pathfinder Ascendancy class, whose focus is on enhancing your flasks. It'll turn your life flask into a massive life regeneration buff, and it's going to drastically increase the effect of your defensive flasks, which can be really impressive when you work in certain unique flasks. Now, there's two main ways to run the Toxic Rain build, the Ballista and the non-Ballista version. Here, we're talking about the Ballista version, which lets you get up to 6 of these bad boys, launching enough Toxic Rains to blot out the sun, resulting in a lot more of these overlapping damage pods, and thus the ability to deal much more damage. Perfect for taking down bosses. This build also has really easy gear upgrades. You're going to use the same level 5 unique bow, Quill Rain, all the way into the late endgame. Quill Rain's increased projectile speed makes the Toxic Rain fall faster, which really helps for speedruns. On to build number 7, the Cold DoT Elementalist. This build uses a wide variety of cold skills to stack a bunch of different damage over time, or DoT, effects, leading to massive damage. You even have flexibility to choose what cold skills you want to use, though there's definitely some optimal recommended setups. Arcthorin advises that we don't mention any specific skills because you're gonna get a bunch of grognards come in here and say, no, actually that's not the best skill setup, you should be using this. Vortex, Creeping Frost, Cold Snap. Come at me, bro! To run this build, you start by picking the Witch class, and then you take the Elementalist Ascendancy, which specializes in inflicting elemental ailments and increases your area of effects. Two things that'll be very useful for us, regardless of what skills you're picking. You technically don't need to pick the Elementalist to run this build, but this is the best setup for mapping. This build is a great all-rounder that scales well without the need for high-end gear. It's versatile, you have options on how you want to build it, what skills you take. It applies massive crowd control, slowing enemies, which really helps in boss fights. It's also a hardcore viable build. You can build it up to be tankier if you need to, and the chill effects really help keep you alive by keeping enemies slowed and away from you. One thing to bear in mind with this build, however, it can be really button intensive. You're using many different skills, and that means you're pressing a lot of buttons really often, and that could be a plus for some people, but for those of us getting on in age, that's like carpal tunnel city. My wrist sounds like a sand mixer. Also, if you want to scale this build into the end game, you need good knowledge of gearing. On to build number 8, the Hexblast Mines Saboteur. Hexblast is a chaos spell that targets an enemy for a big hit of chaos damage. If the damaged enemy was cursed, it'll then remove the curse and deal double damage plus a massive area of effect explosion around the target. Now, you want that double damage. I mean, who wouldn't? So this build involves reapplying curses to enemies frequently. This build is also unique in its ability to apply elemental ailments like Ignite, Shock, and Freeze, even though it's dealing chaos damage. Now, the problem with Hexblast is it has a casting time of 1 second. 1 full second. That's insanely long in a game as fast-paced as Path of Exile. However, we can get around this by applying Hexblast via mines instead. Mines have their own mine-throwing speed, which will overwrite the Hexblast casting time. So, to run this build, you start by picking the Shadow Core class. It's a hybrid intelligence dexterity class who fights with claws and daggers. Then you move into the Saboteur Ascendancy class, who specializes in laying traps and mines. This build excels at boss killing. Surprised? Yeah, I know most of these League-siders are good at clearing, bad at bosses, so if you're looking for a build that deals high damage at every stage of the game, especially against bosses, here you are. And when you know your boss fights, you can also lay down your mines before the boss phases so that the moment they become targetable, they go boom. The build is also decent at mapping too because it deals big area damage. Now, this build is on the squishier side. It's not a glass cannon, not quite, but still not recommended for hardcore because you just don't have enough defense options to really focus on. This build is also dependent on getting some specific gear, so you will need to play the trade game for this one. On to build number 9, the DoT Elementalist. Everyone loves Corpse Explosion, right? Well, Detonate Dead is Path of Exile's version of this classic. You explode a corpse, damaging enemies in an area. Now, in order to not be reliant on enemies to spawn corpses, you take Desecrate, which is a spell that summons corpses. If only we had that in Diablo 2 20 years ago. Detonate Dead's explosion deals a fixed amount of fire damage, and then also deals an amount of damage that scales based on the corpse's max life. To run this build, you start by picking the Witch class, and then you take the Elementalist Ascendancy to buff that fire damage. Because this build's damage scales off of a corpse's max life, you get to deal awesome damage with basically no gear. You're not relying on a better weapon to scale your damage, just better corpses. This makes this build an ideal choice if you don't want to bother with trading or crafting. Also, this build is a 2-button playstyle. You desecrate to spawn your corpses, then you detonate to deal damage. So you're constantly spamming these 2 buttons, which again can be painful on the wrist for some folks. In fact, I literally have in my notes here from Falsterin, I hate this build, but it's really good. Then lastly, onto build number 10, the Impending Doom Pathfinder. Impending Doom is a support skill that supports Hex curses. When a curse expires, it triggers a chaos explosion in a nice area around the cursed target. But you're going to be forcing curses to expire prematurely, because there's a limit to how many curses you can have on an enemy, and when you exceed that limit by applying another curse, you cause the oldest curse to expire, thereby making a boom. So in order to quickly exceed that limit, you'll need the Vixen's Entrapment Unique Gloves, which makes you trigger additional curses. You'll also use the Spell Cascade Support Gem, which will trigger 2 additional explosions that can overlap. This gives the build excellent area of effect clear speed. However, you do need some specific gear to really make this build work, so it's not recommended for solo self-found players, and you do need to invest into your gear quite a bit before you're dealing good boss damage. So that's our list, but I encourage you folks to sound off in the comments. What are the best League starters in your opinion? What build are you going to go with? What skills do you use in your cold DoT Elementalist? Do sound off in the comments because that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykkers Raiders for more ARPG content.